And here we are for another episode of Tuesday Night Live, and it's a pretty empty house at the moment. It's just me and Nick at the moment. How you going, Nikki?
Not too bad. What are we going to talk about?
Well, I don't know. I don't know where Macca is. He gets a black mark. Pete has excused himself for the evening. So if there's anyone around, Scorpus, or even Danos, if you're listening, or PJ Crows that wants to come on, feel free. There's a few empty slots. But in the meantime, I guess we'll just battle on the two of us, Nick, and there's probably some news about, so how about we go straight to that?
There's definitely some news about, and there's actually something that's just come up on the Age 36 minutes ago that made me go a little bit, So Simon Lethlean apparently is in the mix for the Collingwood CEO position, that he and Maguire have had a recent meeting. So, yeah, that's kind of interesting.
Evening all.
There he is! You ratbag Macca.
I'm sorry, we went out for dinner, just a little bit late.
I told you, didn't I?
Yep.
Yeah, Lethlean, that's an interesting one because you would think that if he's resigned himself from an AFL post, technically speaking, any job at Collingwood would still be under the guise of the AFL. So, where does that sit from a basic employment standpoint?
Well, because they are a separate entity, but yeah, I find that really interesting, particularly with why he had to leave, which was issues to do with abusing power. That's not really somebody you still want around in the AFL system for a while, you would think.
Yeah, a little bit surprising, isn't it?
I wonder how the women at Collingwood feel about that potential appointment.
They're probably used to it.
Oh, well, if anyone will do it, Collingwood will do it. Eddie will do what he wants to do. So, yeah, what else have we got?
Well, the other one was that once again there was a poor form by a supporter, this one a Dockers fan in a corporate box, who abused Daniel Pearce, who was one of the emergency players for Fremantle on the weekend. To be fair, though, that person did actually report themselves to the club. The club will meet with them, and Daniel has said he doesn't want to take it any further. But it's not the first time he has experienced racism. And I think, what has he said? I try to put experiences like this behind me and realise it demonstrates a lack of understanding and education on behalf of the person.
It's strange, and to be stupid enough to be an abusive person, or racist, and then report yourself. They're sort of contradictory, unless the person just felt so much shame.
Yeah, because I think it was mentioned. Others around did say no. This was what was said. From what I understand, it was actually reported to staff, and because it had been talked about in the media, he was just like, "Yeah, that was me."
Oh, so he didn't volunteer before it became an item.
I'm not too sure. The other thing is we've had two retirements. So Garrick Ibbotson from Freo and Sam Butler from West Coast have both announced that they'll finish up this season as their last. And the Pies are back on Collingwood. They have met. The review has been handed in. Apparently, it's going to take a while for them to decide what they're going to do on that.
Yeah, I can't remember what the magazine or paper was. I read online that they were saying this morning that Buckley was going to hand his resignation in at that particular meeting, but they couldn't have been more wrong because it hadn't happened.
Well, it may have happened, Macca, and they may have asked him just to the final game and announce his resignation after the season. That's what I reckon.
Well, you might be on the money there because that would be a nicer way of doing it.
Yeah, so we won't know what's happening there. It's interesting a few of the names that are being bandied about, and find it quite interesting the one that we know is quite likely to become a head coach down the track. But Teague hasn't been mentioned in a lot of the discussions on who's going to coach Gold Coast or Collingwood.
Well, Teague one day we'll lose him. I think he will become a senior coach one day. I hope it's not for a couple of years though.
No, we quite like what he's doing with our forward line. Just on the MRP stuff, there was a lot of fines that went back and forth. We did talk about Carlisle being reported twice, but they were both judged to be below the force required, and it was an open hand, so they've both been dismissed. But Tom Jonas has accepted his 2 games on rough conduct on Dalhouse, and he has a poor record, which is why it was the 2 games instead of just 1.
Did anybody listen to 5AA this afternoon?
I understand there was some interesting comments made that they didn't think there wasn't much in it, but he was remorseful. So if there wasn't anything in it, why are you feeling remorse?
Well, the interesting one with Stephen Rowe, who's obviously got great vision problems because, or has never seen the vision of it, because he said it's unfair that he's been reported and suspended because he's a backman and he only just bumped the player, because that's what backmen do. You expect a backman to do that. Well, because when you watch the vision, it's not in play whatsoever, and he's actually forearmed him. He hasn't bumped him.
That doesn't surprise me from Rowie at all. Now, so our game coming up, the Crouch boys need to do probably what they've been doing for most of the season, and if they get 60 possessions between the pair of them, they will then go to the top of the table as the greatest possessions by a set of brothers in an AFL regular season.
Yes, and actually, I think that between them, that in total, I think is their average, isn't it?
Yeah, they're getting close to that. It's very interesting that the ones who currently sit at the top are the Corns brothers, and they played every game that season, whereas Brad missed the first 5 games at the start of this season.
Well, that's true. He did.
You can imagine if they're not going to get it this season, they'll definitely get it future.
Oh, easily. And Matt and Jake Cleaver have been named in the AFLPA's 40-man 22 under-22 squad. Very interestingly, out of that is Geelong have no players named.
Yeah, and we've got the 2, haven't we? And I think it's Lever's 3rd time, I think, and Matt Crouch's 2nd.
Yep, and the ones who have the most are, you've got Melbourne with Oscar McDonald, Jaden Hunt, Christian Trucker, Clayton Oliver, and the Bulldogs have Bontempelli, Daniel Hunter and McLean, and also Sydney with Callum Mills, Tom Papley, Isaac Heaney, and Zach Jones.
It's interesting that Sydney list that you just read out, because we always consider Sydney such a mature team, and yet they've done extremely well with their newcomers this year.
You're quite right about that. I've had quite a few Sydney players in my dream team, and I watch them very closely, and I've been amazed how well their youngsters have done, because there are others apart from those that have been named. I mean, they got young Newman, who at times has gone over the ton in dream team, which is a reflection of getting the ball a lot of times, and he's a beautiful kicker of the ball as well. So that. I think they do have one advantage on us. They have some access to some academy players, don't they?
Yes, and most of those players came through the academy, or 3 of them did. And what they've managed to do is, whilst they're still that mature team, they've been able to bring these players in to work with the more senior players, and they're the ones who. And we saw it on the weekend, the way Sydney try to protect their own teammates in such a way. So that's kind of helped too.
Well, undoubtedly it would. And Phoenix, just your opinion on this. I think that Sydney and Brisbane, the Gold Coast, etc., with academies, is it time that all clubs have the opportunity to have an academy?
Well, look, I think what we just talked about shows the distinct advantage that an academy can bring. I mean, Sydney have to speculate far less with their youngsters simply because they have access to that higher end talent. I think you're going to be hard pressed to get an academy up in Adelaide and Perth, because I think the Victorian clubs will feel that that's too much of an unfair advantage, and they will say that the academies are designed for development states only. But my personal opinion is that I think every state should have an academy, including Victoria, and that each club should be able to bid on academy players, and it should be part of the draft.
Yeah, that's where I was coming from, because ultimately, if it keeps going, that only the developing states have it, they'll eventually be stacked with talent to the point that they will have a very, very distinct advantage over the other teams.
Yep, I agree. It's a bloody hosh-posh at the moment. It's all over the place, and you know, you look at results and statistics over the last few years and you wonder when you can say that the competition is genuinely balanced. At the moment, I mean, we had the influx of GWS and Gold Coast prior to that. We've had the advent of academies. I mean, when is the system actually going to be balanced? We've got an unbalanced fixture which sees us playing one team in round 22 after having played other teams twice. I mean, it's just a mess at the moment.
Yeah, and also the team that we're playing, West Coast, we're playing away. I think it's the 8th time since 1997, which is what's 20 years. So it'll be the 8th time in 20 years. And the club has the AFL about it before, who said that it would be rotated amongst the clubs a lot more, but it hasn't been. And 8 out of 20, that's just not a fair go.
No, it's not. It's just not. Look, I don't know how you fix it. The AFL aren't going to go to a one like a 17-round season. They're not going to go to a 33-round season or whatever it works out to be, 34-round season. I don't think conferences are the answer. I don't think Gill's little 18-5 or whatever it is the answer. I really don't know what the answer is, but if you sum up all the imbalances in the competition at the moment, it's damn impossible for an established traditional club in an established traditional football state to be successful at the moment, and that includes the majority of Victorian teams, to be honest.
Yep, I can't argue with that. The other thing, I did miss the opening of the news there. Did Nicky, has she mentioned yet about the fact that the umpiring chief, director, whatever his title is, that said that the two crucial decisions, one not pinging Buddy for running too far, was incorrect, and of course that the umpire, as we discussed in our wrap of the game, should have called play on.
That I was holding fire, particularly on that first one, for the cockwomble.
Yeah, well, that business with Mills, and the umpiring director said that he should have, because he was so slow calling it, he should have just called play on.
Well, as Phoenix noted on Sunday night, it was pretty quickly done. So by the time he's actually blown the whistle, held his hands up for that signal, he'd started to try to signal for the next bit, but it had gone on by then because it was just such a quick time period. And that's the problem with having the umpires having to do hand signals. Actually take away a bit of that time if you've got players playing on such as that.
Yeah, and while in general, I think that we got a reasonably good go. It's amazing that the one thing that turned the game on its head was an incorrect decision.
Yeah, but if we're 5 goals up as we should have been, Macca, that wouldn't have been an issue. And, I mean, really, we did get a good run, and the umpires, whilst there was a decision at the death, there was also a terrible turnover at the death too by Rory Atkins. So everyone makes mistakes, and I don't think we can complain about the umpiring this week, that's for sure.
No, I wasn't overall, and I just wanted to make the point that that has been a controversy and a lot of talk about it, and it was interesting just to note that they were incorrect. You're right. You're quite right. I mean, the game was ours to win in many ways, and we had so many shots for goals that it should have been we kicked points and win instead of goals. And Atkins disgraceful kick in that dying stage of the match when you should really be at your most careful rather than hilarious, and that also you could argue cost the game as well.
Oh, Smithers had a shock on as well.
It was interesting that Pikey at the end in his press conference mentioned that, there's some things that we could have done differently in those last 3 or 4 minutes. And I think when you have a look back at the replay, you see that we didn't really handle those last few minutes well when we had the game won. We didn't really try to shut the game down. I thought we kept playing the same way, whereas we really should have recognised that there were, just a few minutes left. We had a good lead or a good enough lead, and we could have maintained possession a little bit better rather than still taking risks and handing the ball over.
Oh, yeah, couldn't argue with that at all. Because when I reflect back on the game, I can't recall any particular defensive action that we took that we probably should have done.
Well, interestingly, on of all places, the Sunday Footy Show, they highlighted the fact that when we did fall behind and we had, a minute and a half left to go, they highlighted that when we were coming in off the outer wing towards the end there, we actually had 2 behind the ball, and Sydney had Reid as a spare in our forward line. So, I think there was some set-up issues. Having 2 behind the ball when you're 3 points down with a minute to go really isn't going to win you the game. A few things to work on there just in terms of how we shut a game down when we've got a winning lead, I think.
Yeah, and do you think that possibly the coaching staff allowed it to go that way just to see what would happen, or do you think that or did they just blindly back faith, or what do you think?
Well, I would have thought that those sort of circumstances are drilled, and I would have thought that the players they talk very much about the players having responsibility for structure on the ground, and Pike gives the players credit for being able to make adjustments to structure, mid-quarter and all that sort of stuff. So I don't think the coaches would have necessarily tried to manufacture that structure. I think that would have been player-driven, and I think as a consequence, there was obviously a breakdown of communication in those last few minutes, and I don't think it's something that was done on purpose. I don't think the coaches let it go on purpose. I think when you're that close, you may as well win the game, and I think that's how the coaches would have seen it.
Yeah, I can't remember any. As I say, I can't remember any particular effort by us to either run down the clock or take extra defensive pressure.
Well, we had 2 behind the ball, mate. We had 2 behind the ball, and then when we fell behind, we still had 2 behind the ball. So we did that at the very least. Although, as you rightly point out, and I agree, we didn't seem to change the way that we were playing. We didn't try to hold possession and shut the game down. We were still trying to move the ball and score, which was probably the wrong way to go about it at that point. But that's the benefit of playing that kind of a game so late in the season compared to last year where we just basically coasted into finals under little or no pressure. At least we've been able to take some quote-unquote learnings from the game, and better to stuff it up in round 22 than in a qualifying final.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully put. it is good for us to have had that game, and probably in some ways it's probably good that we lost it because it'll enable the coaches to reinforce the areas that we really have to improve on if that situation were to be repeated. So, yeah, and it was played at finals type pressure, so it was a very good game to have at that particular time.
Well, and Squibby
It was very interesting.
Sorry, Nikki. Squibby makes a good point on the chat too, whether we ran out of legs. I don't know whether we did, but as Don pointed out in the press, it was 3 games in 30 days that we played. So maybe we were at the end of our and maybe it didn't affect us from a legs point of view, but maybe concentration.
Yeah, for me, it seemed to be a bit more concentration. I'll agree with you on that one. So what I was just going to say before, it was really interesting on AFL 360 on Thursday. They actually had Josh Gibson in, replacing Brian Lake, to have a chat with Nick Del Santo. And they were discussing about the game as to who would it be a benefit to Adelaide to actually drop a game, because it didn't really matter, etc. And Gibson actually talked about how when Hawthorn were at their most potent, they would generally drop a game just before finals. And he said it was always good to do that. You just got that little kick in the pants. That way you weren't going in too complacent into the finals. And so his opinion was that Adelaide would probably try to win, but if they didn't win, it wouldn't be too much of a problem and could actually be a blessing in disguise in a way.
Yeah, I saw that, and but the one thing it does do, of course, I think it puts a little bit of pressure to this week to win against West Coast, only because I don't think you'd want to go into a final with 2 losses under your belt.
No, I think that would be negative momentum. Although I think the week off kind of breaks that up a bit, Macca. But I do agree. I'd rather see us win this week than to lose. And as an aside, I think all the premiers over the last few years have dropped a game in August. So I do agree that I certainly don't think it's the end of the world that we drop that game. The thing that probably worries me the most, apart from Charlie Cameron's form, is the fact that given that we had far less riding on it than Sydney did, the fact that we failed under pressure to kick gimme goals is a real concern for mine.
Yeah, it was interesting because I can't remember where I saw it or heard it, but they were talking about the fact that champion data on our average goal kicking and on Sydney's average goal kicking worked out that we should have won by 40 points.
Yeah, but you know what averages are like. They only work out at the end of the season. So, anyway, I'm a bit concerned, Nikki, about a bit of injury news that we had from the club this week as well.
The Galucci.
Yeah, so the Gooch is gone with a fractured jaw. Probably won't play for the rest of the season.
No, he's out. It's broken in 2 places. Had surgery yesterday, and they did say that scans on Talia's ankle has revealed some slight tear, but it's not too bad. But as we were talking about on Sunday night, I hope they rest and don't take him to Perth.
I think they will.
I think Talia will want to, because that's just the bloody stupid type of player he is.
Look, I don't think they will. I think ankles can be bastards, and I think given that there was any damage at all, and given that Hardigan had a decent return back in the SANFL, I think they'll use it as an opportunity to run Hardigan in the ones. As you pointed out, Nikki, too, that Talia does struggle with Kennedy anyway. He's carrying a groin. He's now got this ankle. We need him cherry ripe for finals. He's got the opportunity to basically have a 20-day break. I think you give it to him.
Yeah, I hope that's what they do.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see. But Mike does have a philosophy. He likes to play his best 22.
Yeah, but he's not going to. I would be highly surprised, Macca, if he wants to play his best 22 in what amounts to a dead rubber when you've got to travel 3.5 hours, 2 ways. I just don't see that they're going to play him if he's not 100%.
Well, we'll know in a few days anyhow.
So what I actually thought, because the three of us discussed the game on Sunday pretty much, and I thought it'd be interesting to actually go through each of the games coming up for this round and to see where we think the results are going to end up, because it's going to be quite an interesting round of football that almost every game has something riding on it.
Yeah, well, let's go through them, Nick. We'll start with the Friday night game, Hawthorn Bulldogs. Obviously, Bulldogs need to win to keep their chances alive.
And you've got Luke Hodges' very last game ever. Now, although there still is the ridiculous chance they could still get in with a win, it's very highly unlikely, but it's still kind of... for my mind, I think Hawthorn wins that one.
Yeah, I think on the way they're playing at the moment, maybe Hawthorn, but I don't think the Bulldogs can make it, even if they win. They would be relying on probably at least two other sides to lose, wouldn't they?
Well, mathematically they can make it, but yes, you're right. They are relying on other results now, and they didn't impress me at all against Port last week, and I actually think Hawthorn are the best team out of the 8. Their early season form notwithstanding. So I'm with you, Nick. Hawks get up and the Bulldogs become the first team since, what was it, 2008 to...
2009.
2009 not to make the finals the year after a premiership.
And that was Hawthorn who did that year, so it'd be quite interesting if they were the ones to ensure that the Bulldogs don't do it. So then the next game, backing up once... is 1:15 at a time. So Collingwood, Melbourne. So Collingwood are definitely out, but you've got the scenario of they don't know who's going to be their coach. You have players who are playing for their careers to actually stay in that team and in that club, and you've got Melbourne who need to win to try and ensure they also have a place in the 8.
Well, this is an interesting game because Collingwood do have talent, and they don't always put it together, and they don't seem to have a very coherent game plan that works all the time. And certainly they do a lot of crisscrossing and going sideways, etc. But on the rare occasions that they attack full-bloodedly, they can go quite well. So Melbourne wouldn't want to take the game too easily because they could go under. I think Melbourne will win it, but Collingwood are probably capable of an upset if they played at their best.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. They're two very strong midfields, but Melbourne, I think, are better at each end of the ground. And, it'll be a test for Melbourne because they do need to win, obviously, and they're prone to losing games they need to win. I think actually Melbourne deserve to be in the final 8 this year, so it'll be disappointing for them if they lost, and I expect them to get up.
Yeah, I agree with you, but another point you made is quite valid too. They've dropped quite a few they've been expected to win.
They seem to be tiring a bit. So whether their intense type of game that they've been trying to play has taken its toll on a lot of the younger players. They can't do it for the whole game or for the majority of a game anymore.
It's possible. They play a very physical game and they try and get a running game going as well. And when they win, they're trying to do both at once. And their players will be better at it next year because they have a lot more stamina. They'll have another pre-season training for it. But I think Goodwin's done a good job to get him as far as he has. And I don't think they're going to go too far, but I think they've done well to get where they are.
Yeah, I think with the midfield that they have and freshened up with a bye, if they do make it, they'll cause some problems for whoever comes up against them in the finals if they're there. I do agree with you. I think they have hit the wall a little bit. It's the first year for a while that they've played that they've added some offensive flair to their defensive structures that they honed under Roos. Goody's obviously added some attack to the defence, and you're right, I think it's taken its toll, but you never know. If they make it with a week off, I think that elimination final will be difficult for whoever comes up against them, which would probably be Port Adelaide.
They'd be capable of beating Port.
Oh, any team in the 8 would be capable of beating Port. Come on, Macca.
Just on that particular point, have Port beaten a team that's currently in the 8 or not?
No.
Yes, one. Sydney.
Which one? Yeah, but that was at the very start of the year where 5 other teams also beat Sydney.
No, the question is, have they beaten a team that is currently in the 8? The answer is yes, one, Sydney. We've beaten the most current top 8 teams with 8. The ABC actually put out a list. So we've beaten 8. I think the next best is Sydney with 5.
That's a very valid point, and that's one of the reasons why I asked the question, because I knew that we'd done very well at it, and that will stand us in good stead in the finals.
Now, for me, the next game is the most interesting one of the round, because it's going to be the tank or not to tank game between Brisbane and North up at the Gabba.
Yeah, on paper, yes. I did hear, I can't remember who it was from Brisbane talking, and they were saying that they're not concerned about whether they get number 1 draft pick or not, because history shows that the number 1 draft pick is rarely the best player. It turns out to be the best player. That, in that first half dozen, there'll be players that are as good or much better than that particular player.
Well, for my mind, I've always thought that Brisbane, because it's at their home ground, they want to finish on a high note. They've actually performed quite well. I think North will actually be tanking it, purely, but also because they've got no rucks. They're actually going to have to bring in Ben Brown into the ruck because they've lost Goldstein.
Yeah, I genuinely think that North Melbourne have been tanking for a while now, and so I think that Brisbane will be trying to win, and they'll probably win the game, and Northville will get their wish and finish bottom.
Just as an aside to this game, there's been controversy for years now about tanking, and it seems that you've got to be able to do it in a way that is not too obvious. Melbourne couldn't pull that off, but I think you're right. I think North Melbourne have pulled that off this year. Is it time for the AFL to introduce a draft lottery for the bottom 8 teams or for the first top 10 draft picks?
Absolutely. I think it is time. It's the only way you'll stop it. And as we said, as I just said previously, that history has shown that if you get a top 10 draft pick, you've got just as much chance of getting a good player as any other team has. And so I think the draft would solve that particular.
Yeah, that's the one thing I actually don't mind out of the NFL, what they do, where you have that lottery, and then you see a whole lot of trading picks going on. I mean, the AFL's kind of brought that in already with the ability to trade picks, so I think it is the next logical step they should be taking.
Yeah, that's what I meant, lottery, not trade. But no, the lottery I think is an excellent idea.
I think it's a no-brainer, and if you look at the NBA, which has had the lottery for ages, the other thing that they can do at the NBA is they can trade right up until their pick on draft day. That would be awesome, I reckon.
That would be fun.
Including the day of?
Up to the minute, Macca.
That would put some spice into it.
I'm not sure of the parameters because I don't follow the NBA as much as I follow the NFL, but I do know that they can trade picks on draft day. I don't know whether they can trade players or how it all works, but I know that there is still trading going on draft day. But I think, back to the main point, I think a draft lottery for the top 10 picks is a no-brainer. I don't know why they haven't already done it. and surely it needs to come in over the next couple of years, but it doesn't even seem to be on the table at the moment.
No, that's interesting because I'm like you. I think it is a no-brainer, and it totally removes the stigma of tanking because tanking becomes pointless.
What's next, Nick?
Then we've got I also think this one's kind of interesting because we've got Carlton and Sydney. Now, a lot of people are predicting that, oh yeah, Sydney's going to win that easy. I'm not so sure about that.
What makes you think that, Nikki?
Because this is what happens particularly we've seen it before in the last couple of seasons. When you have teams that are out of the eight, they do upset wins because you have players that are fighting for their careers, as opposed to players that are actually trying not to get injured leading into finals. They're still playing for a spot in the final team and they want to do a good showing, but there's also that whole little thing at the back of their mind, don't get injured, don't get injured. Well, and Carlton have actually been playing quite well.
Well, they played very well last week. But having said that, I think Sydney will beat them, and I think they'll beat them relatively comfortably because they've still got a chance of getting getting into the top four.
I'm a bit with you, Nick. I think Carlton will put up a good fight. And, they beat a good team last week, Hawthorn, and, they've taken it up to teams like us. I don't know whether they've necessarily got the cattle to beat Sydney. Sydney have been on a big, long run to get to where they are, a long run, and I think it's actually going to count against Sydney during the finals that they've had to win so many games to get where they've gotten. And if I was a Sydney supporter, I actually wouldn't mind dropping the Carlton game because I don't think they're going to make top four anyway. Richmond are playing bloody St Kilda. I don't think St Kilda will trouble Richmond too much. So I wouldn't mind if I was a Sydney supporter if they drop this game.
Well, the only chance I see it is if they have a mental lapse because they've had such a long, intense run, culminating in an extremely intense game against ourselves, and then they look at it and say it was only Carlton. So that would be the only way, in my opinion, that they would lose it by subconsciously not going as hard as normal.
Well, Simon Moyle in the chat points out Sydney are playing for a home final. Well, that would mean if they want a home final, they need to lose, not win. Because if they make top four, that means they have to travel either to Adelaide or down to Melbourne, possibly.
Yeah, but if they lose, I think they can go 7, can't they?
I can't answer that.
Yeah, because that's why I find this game also to be really interesting because there's so many different permutations as to what can happen with that one, and I think it does them a little bit of disservice because it's one of the earlier games. They don't quite know what's going to happen with other teams.
Actually, just looking at the ladder, they would have to monumentally lose and Melbourne monumentally win in order to drop from 6 because they're on 122 percentage and Melbourne's on 106. So they're going to get a home final unless they get to 4th. So you're right. Without having known that at the time, it probably backs up my point that it mightn't be such a bad thing for Sydney to drop one, notwithstanding that top 4 does give them a second chance.
And it also gives them a chance to, if they win, to host a preliminary final.
Now, here's the game that's probably going to impact how we take our game the most. Geelong and GWS at Simmons Stadium.
Yeah, it's an interesting game, isn't it? Because Geelong, I think that there's no sign of Selwood back, and I don't think. And Geelong, they've looked pretty ordinary, very ordinary, and I think GWS will beat them.
Yeah, there's a lot of very good sides that have gone down and got smacked at Cardinia Park. If I was to put money on this game, I'd probably back a sneaky Geelong win, to be honest.
Yeah.
And what quite hilariously happens there is that whilst Geelong want to win this because they want a finals at Simmons Stadium, if this is likely to be the only final then to be played that weekend in Victoria, the AFL is very likely to move the game to the MCG, and they'll end up playing GWS on the MCG instead of at the home stadium. And oh my God, the bleating will be hilarious.
Yeah, to me it's a no-brainer. I don't think they should be playing any finals at Simmons Stadium, whatever it's called, because they win the right to have a home state final, and they don't win to have their little suburban ground, which can only hold a certain amount. It's not good enough.
Well, yes and no. GWS got to play their prelim final at Metricon last year. I don't mind.
Not a Metro. Gold Coast.
I always get those two mixed up. Spotless, but I don't mind them playing at Skilled in the first week of the finals. I think that's appropriate, but I think after that it should be at the biggest stadium at the ground, and I think the Giants should have played at ANZ Stadium last year. Like if Geelong win, then they'll be playing, more than likely, they will be playing the Giants again, and they'll be playing them again, likely, at Skilled Stadium. So if you're the Giants, you've got a lot of incentive to win this game because you don't want to have to go down there 2 weeks in a bloody row.
Exactly. That's why I think that they've got the class to do it, and I think that they will have the intensity to do it because for the very reason you just said, the advantage of them playing Geelong away from that little dunghill, and it's not really dunghill, that's unfair, but that ground, that skinny ground, and playing on Spotless, they'd clean them up. I think they'd clean up Geelong at Spotless every time, and I think they'll be desperate to win it.
Now the next one we've got that night is Port and Gold Coast.
Just before you go on to that.
Yep.
The other permutation with the Geelong Giants game is if the Geelong lose, they stay on 58 points, which means that Richmond, if they win, will actually, which I think they will actually push Geelong down to fourth spot, meaning that if we, like what we were just talking about is probably not true because Geelong will actually play us at Adelaide Oval in the first week if they lose to the Giants this week.
Yeah, that's very likely, isn't it?
So then do we lose to make sure that we don't play them?
I'm not a fan of avoiding teams, you know that, so I think we just go ahead and win the game. But if we lose, the Giants win, Giants go top, we go second, Richmond will be third, so we'll play Richmond at home. If we win and the Giants win, then we'll be playing Richmond at home. So if we lose and the Giants win, we'll be playing the Cats at home.
Yes. Right.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting as to how these sides tackle each other, very much so. And I think there'll be, a bit like we saw a little bit of ducks and drakes in our game against Sydney, I think there'll be a little bit similar going on, but with both teams also wanting to win.
Yeah, interesting if you're a coach of any of the top four teams, and not forgetting that if Richmond do happen to lose, it does also open the door for Port and Sydney to get into the top four. But if you're any of the coaches, you're conscious that you're likely going to be playing these teams again in the finals. At what point do you keep your powder dry? And at what point do you play your hand in order to win the game? It's a very interesting little conundrum.
I think you put yourself in the best position to win the first final you play in, and so that you can have a home preliminary final. Because not necessarily last year, but in terms of history, it's proven that the home preliminary final is very, very valuable in getting into the grand final. So I think that they'll be very conscious of winning.
Now, I think this game's pretty much a dead rubber, which is Port and Gold Coast.
Well, no, because if Port win and Richmond lose, they can get into top 4.
Correct.
Yeah, but is Gold Coast actually going to do anything?
Well, no, and that gives Port a distinct advantage because you could see Port winning by 100 points in this game. They've already got the second best percentage in the comp. So it does put pressure on Richmond because there's no way, even if Richmond beat St Kilda by a fair amount, lose to St Kilda by a very small amount, they're going to be out of the top 4. So, and Port winning against Gold Coast by a heap keeps Sydney at bay if Sydney also happen to win and Richmond lose. So it's all to play for Port Adelaide, and they should be throwing everything at this game.
Yeah, you're 100% right there. And Rowi's been crapping on all week about the possibility of a showdown final. Well, I don't want a showdown final. I just want to see Port kicked straight out of the finals.
Yeah, but I was quite pleased with the last showdown final. So then we move on to Sunday. Now, this one I think could be a little bit of a dead rubber, depending on what's kind of going on, because you've got Essendon at Etihad up against Fremantle, and Fremantle are just deplorable. Although, weirdly enough, they've been playing not too badly in Melbourne. They play worse at home.
They have, strangely enough, Nicky, and they also played a good first quarter last week, and then after that they just played 3 quarters of absolute sheer utter crap. And I was watching the game and I abandoned it pretty quickly because it was pretty horrible to watch, quite frankly. If they played like they did in the first quarter, they could make at least an interesting game of it. But I think Essendon will take care of them comfortably.
Well, the interesting thing about this game is that if the Bulldogs and or St Kilda win, and the Bulldogs play before the Bombers, then they will be in the 8 until the Bombers win. So the Bombers have to win this game to stay in, with 3 teams, West Coast, St Kilda and the Bulldogs on equal points, albeit smaller percentage. But Essendon's percentage isn't big enough for them to feel comfortable. They have to win the game.
Now, if Essendon win the game, does that mean that West Coast can't make the 8?
West Coast would have to beat us, I think, by an extra 30 points over whatever Essendon win by.
Well, Essendon could. It would be possible for Essendon to get quite a reasonably good win, and if they played at their very best, and Fremantle produced the form that they have been producing, well, you'd expect them to win by probably 8 to 10 goals.
I agree, which would mean that West Coast would have to beat us by probably 12 to 15.
That won't happen.
And then there's, of course, the Richmond-St Kilda game, which is the 250 game at the MCG. And as you said before, Phoenix, I mean, Richmond really should be winning this one.
Yeah, St Kilda haven't really come to the line with any conviction at all. They're under 100 percentage points. Richmond, if they want to prove themselves as a finals contender, they should be knocking off St Kilda in grand style and finishing off the home and away season on a bit of a high. And all that being said, it's Richmond, and so I reckon it might be a close tussle.
Yeah, I agree with you. The big variable in there is the fact that they are Richmond and that they have this history of managing to stuff things up for themselves in lumps many, many a time.
And if anybody's got to Richmond it up, it's going to be Richmond. But it's also, as Vardy Magic points out, it's Revolt's last game.
Yeah, but I would think that the Richmond supporters, having been used to a lifetime of pain, they'd be fearing the game and they'd be very glad when the game's over and that they've won it, if they do win it. I mean, even Caroline Wilson, who's a fanatical Richmond supporter, pointed out that they could theoretically still finish 9th.
Very, very highly unlikely to happen.
Well, they can't now, but Richmond will be playing that game after the Port and Sydney game. So, assuming Port and Sydney both win, which we expect, both Sydney and Port Adelaide will be above Richmond at the start of this game. And you can almost see Richmond dropping it and losing not only the top 4 spot, but actually going down as low as 6th.
Yeah, that's quite possible, isn't it? Because it is Richmond, and they've got this history. But I mean, if you take it on just sheer form guide, like if you did with racehorses, you'd say, well, Richmond will bolt in by many lengths, but it's Richmond.
And when we're discussing this, I think Richmond have the most to lose in this entire round. I mean, I know that there's teams vying for a final 8 spot, but when you talk about momentum into a final series and the difference between, being top 4 and bottom 4 of the top 8, Richmond have the most to lose, and Richmond don't do well in those circumstances usually.
No, yeah. And they've got, and they do have an unusual structure done, which has been created by necessity, really, in the fact they've only got one tall in their forward line. It's a strange setup that they've really got, and that's why I don't think they're going to go very far in the finals. But it's worked for them in the home and away games to some degree so far. But that will also, I think, be their eventual downfall.
Yeah, they work quite well being the hunter. They don't cope when they're the hunted, because you just have to look at how they performed down at Geelong, and they had everything to win for that game, and they just balls it up completely.
It's a perfect example, Nikki. That game is the game that they should have won, and they didn't. And, I think from an Adelaide Crows perspective, you'd rather Richmond in the top 4 than either Sydney or Port. It's not that I rate Port, but playing Port in a final just adds that showdown dynamic to it, and I think if you could have a game without that dynamic, I think you'd rather have that, because traditionally showdowns are always a 50-50, and I think Port would be pumping up that fact. So I'll be barracking for Richmond, but not with any conviction, that's for sure.
Same here.
And then that leaves the very last game of the round, us and West Coast. And West Coast, last game ever at Subiaco before the move to the new stadium. But then again, we saw what Fremantle dished up for their last ever game. You've got Mitchell and Pritis's last game, and they might still also be vying for a spot in the 8.
I think that's probably going to be a very important factor in the game in terms of the fact if they can no longer make the 8, I don't think they'll come out with the intensity that they would if they still do have a chance of making the 8. So I expect us to go over there and win the game, because I think that it's important that we do, and we do have a better side. But I think how the game is played and the intensity level at which it is played will depend on these other results.
Well, irrespective of any results, Macca, they will have a mathematical chance because they're on the same points as Essendon and 2 percentage points below them. So, as I mentioned earlier, Essendon win, then they have to beat us by, 20 or 30 points more than what Essendon win by. So they will have a chance. If Essendon win big over Fremantle, which is what we expect, then it may take the wind out of West Coast sails a little bit. But if Essendon only squeak over the line, then West Coast will think they're in with a sneaky chance. And as you mentioned, I don't think they'll be playing so hard for Mitchell because he's only been there a season, but certainly Pritis has been a club stalwart, so they'll be looking to send him off on a high. And I think the big factor is whether the Crows give a damn about top spot.
Yep, that's a big point. I think the coach just likes to win, and so I think that he would like them to win. It's interesting what the players' attitude will be.
For my mind, I'm actually really interested in seeing Matt Crouch up against Mitchell and Prudis, because they're pretty much the two players we're comparing the level we think he can get at.
Well, I don't know about get at. I think Matt Crouch is over. Prentice is on the way down this year, so Matt Crouch has been on the way up, and I'd say that they've crisscrossed and Matt's above him. Mitchell's still been a classy player at West Coast, although if you take his form in the last couple of games, it looks like he retired back about 2 games ago.
Well, and he could be forgiven for that as well. He went over there with a clear goal of coaching with West Coast, playing a year and then coaching, so he'd be seeing the finishing line, I think. There's a couple of variables here. Josh Kennedy's always troubled us, and is vying for the Coleman, so he'll be up and about. I guess the question still remains, irrespective of the GWS Geelong result, do we really care about top spot? Is there anything to gain mentally from top spot rather than dropping down to second?
Only the momentum going into the finals, I think. Then ultimately, no, you're quite right, because first and second get the same rewards if they win, and so really, basically, no, there isn't. But I just don't think we want to lose because of the momentum factor.
Yeah, because we can't downplay that West Coast at West Coast is always a tough game. And yes, West Coast aren't playing at their best at the moment, but they're still not a terrible team. And you get them in front of, their 45,000 crowd, and particularly if they've got a sniff of sneaking into the bottom half of the 8, it's not going to be an easy game. And, players will no doubt be subconsciously thinking about not getting injured, and that generally tends to be when players do get injured. So I don't know. It's a touchy one, isn't it?
Yeah, and look, West Coast, as you said, they're not a mob of mugs, certainly at home. And Kennedy, for some reason, he really dines on us, and he's a top footballer, Kennedy, and I've been watching him in the recent games, and he's very much in form at the moment. So it's not going to be just a gimme game. No, far from that.
Which I think is actually going to be good for our players. I mean, we got that real finals intensity and that real bash and crash style against Sydney. You've got and West Coast are a fairly hard team as well, in a way. They do play a bit physical, not as physical as Sydney, but there's still that little bit going on. And I think it's, as much as we hate having to go over there and play, at least we've got a 9-day break this time, and instead of the 6-day break is what we've had of those other ones. It's just another nice little test for us leading into the finals.
Yeah, the irony is that at the beginning of the season, if we were playing West Coast, you would say to yourself that they had the edge of us over us in the mid. As our seasons progress, I'd say that looking at their midfield versus our midfield, that we will definitely have the edge in the midfield.
So if you're Don Pike and GWS has gotten up over Geelong, what are you telling your players?
Well, you're still telling them to win.
I think so. I think we definitely want to go in with some momentum into the finals.
And if Geelong get up over GWS and you're Pikey, what do you say then?
Same.
Yeah. We've had our loss. We don't want 2 losses going into the finals, as we've just discussed before. The whole thing about finals is you have to play any team anywhere, and you need to be able to win.
Yep, I agree with that, Nicky.
I think if you're Pikey, the last thing you want to do is set us up for failure, and saying, we don't want to lose 2 in a row before finals in a game that we could quite easily lose just because of intensity and mental attitude is actually setting us up for a negative attitude going into finals. So I would be focused. If I was Don Pike, I would take the result out of the equation and focus very much on structure and making the players very focused on what they're supposed to be doing, and let the result take care of itself, to be honest with you. Because if you say to the players before the game, we don't want to lose this game because then it'll be 2 in a row going into finals, we don't want that bad momentum, and then we happen to lose, all of a sudden that's a negative mindset around the club. So I think you take the result out of the equation.
I don't think the coach would, for one moment, address it that way. Well, I don't think he should address it that way, for the very reason that you just said. But I would say that he'd be saying to them something along the lines of that we played reasonably well last week, but we didn't put the game away for certain reasons, and he'd probably just a few of those and just say that we'd be looking to correct that today.
So, what are our predictions? Do we feel like? What I'd like probably is a predicted final 4 in order from you guys.
Well, I think that GWS are going to beat Geelong. This is only my opinion, and I think that in spite of all the witches' curses and all that on Richmond, I think they'll manage to hold their nerve just enough to win their particular game. And I think that if we win West Coast, which I think we will, my order then makes it that we would be 1, GWS would be 2, Richmond would be 3, and Geelong would be 4, which means we would play Geelong at home.
I think we'll be 1. I think Patrick Dangerfield will drag them over the line in some epic way that he always does, and that's all we'll hear is about how fabulous he is. So Geelong will be 2nd, GWS 3rd, and fingers crossed for a friend of mine who is a very stalwart Richmond supporter that Richmond do actually make it into the top 4.
Yep, I'm predicting similar, Nick. I think we'll get up over West Coast. I think Geelong will have a hard-fought win on the back of some Dangerfield magic down at Skilled Stadium and take 2nd. I think GWS obviously will then be relegated to 3rd, and I think Richmond will make hard work of it, but will remain in 4th spot.
Well, personally, I hope you guys are right, because I believe we can beat both Geelong and Richmond, but I think we could beat Richmond a lot easier than we'd beat Geelong.
I just don't like the way you say that, Macca. Finals are a different kettle of fish, and it's the best team on the day, and I think this competition this year has shown that any team can beat any other team on the day, and all I want really going into finals is us to be fit and healthy and in a good frame of mind, because I do believe we can beat anyone on our day, but I don't think there's better or worse scenarios, really.
We'll just have to disagree on that. You've got your opinion, I've got mine, and that's where I sit.
Well, you played for a team that won 22 straight and then went out in straight sets, so I win.
Not straight set, went out in the bloody grand final.
Then again, I played in 5 losing grand finals and never won one, so I guess it's up to Nikki.
Netball, we actually made grand finals twice, lost them both.
We're a bunch of losers.
Oh, Jesus, where's Peter J when you need him?
Right. Although, to be fair, I was coached by my dad. He then coached my 2 sisters in a team when one of them was actually I think she was still only 4. And they pretty much went through the entire season undefeated. In the prelim final, at halftime, he swapped the backs and the forwards, and the backs outscored the forwards in the second half, and they just absolutely annihilated the opposition also in the grand final.
What I'm going to have to say, Nikki, though, at least I took it like a good sport, getting reported for king-eating the opposition.
Macca!
I had to do something. I was really pissed off.
You don't do that. That's naughty.
And on that note, I think we should finish off with a cockwomble, Nikki.
Well, it can only go to Hayden Kennedy this weekend for in describing about Buddy's run down the wing. he, I can't believe that this actually came out of his mouth, that he said, oh yeah, if you look at it in slow motion, he probably ran 20 metres. I hate to explain this little thing to you, Hayden, but it doesn't matter whether you're running fast or slow, distance does not change.
That's exactly right. In fact, I think that he's very generous by only calling it 20 metres. I'd say that probably, well, if you count the number of strides, there was one in between bounces that was 25 paces. So that, to me, that's a pretty good distance.
And the fact is that how we actually have the strips at Adelaide Oval, they are 10 metres. And he ran over two lots of those strips. So he ran over 20 metres.
And they're mown that way for exactly that reason, to give the umpires a guide. I mean, all grounds these days are mown in the same way, to give the umpires a guide. I'd like to have known what his comment was on Atkins running too far, because,
I think he said the second one was actually probably a bit tough.
Yeah, it's a kind way of putting it. Although, the rule does state that you run 15 metres. It doesn't say in a direction. So you can run around in a circle for 20 metres and get done for running too far. So I guess from that perspective, to the letter of the law, it was probably the right decision. But how often do we see blokes do what Rory did and not get pinged? And, so we have Buddy kicking a goal, running 20 metres, and Rory being very, very stiff to get done on the half-back line when he's basically run around in circles.
Yeah, and if you really measure, if you watch him closely and sort of estimate how far he's going, he's probably gone 1 or 2 metres over at best if he has gone over. Then they all do that.
Now, we don't want to give a nomination to, what's his name from Port, for getting 2 weeks right before finals.
Tom Jonas. Well, the other one is they've raised is apparently the younger Corns was getting all excited that Port are able to retain players, and that their culture's so much better than ours because Pittard's going to keep playing even though he's been dropped a number of times.
Yeah, Kane Corns, he said in today's advertiser that Port have a superior culture of retaining players, unlike Adelaide who lose them. And I thought to myself, well, has it ever occurred to you, Kane, you haven't got any bloody players anybody wants?
Well, they certainly didn't mind shopping around last year and couldn't get any buyers. So I don't know whether that's retaining players or just not getting any buyers for players. I think it's the latter, to be honest with you.
And the other thing too, they're talking about Tregenza, that all these great offers for people interested in Tregenza. You
mean Pittard?
No, I'm talking about Tregenza. That because he's also uncontracted at the moment as well. And sorry,
Trengove.
Yeah, because Tregenza's been retired for a very long time.
Yeah, he did make a metamorphosis there. No,
I think you're a bit met off your faces.
It's really great. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, and he's not considered skilled enough or good enough to hold a position in the Port side at the moment. And yet they're saying that, bragging about the fact that they're retaining him against all these advances from outside the club. Well, Jesus. I don't know, perhaps I've got it wrong, but I don't see the players there that people are after.
I tell you what, they've killed a few careers, haven't they? Because Jackson Trengrove was a very good centre-half back, and, all of a sudden they're chucking him in the ruck, playing him up forward, all sorts of stuff, and all of a sudden he looks a shadow of his former self. And the bloke was just a very good defender, and they should have played him as a very good defender and been done with it. They did, they've done that with a few of their players. They've actually burnt them, and as you rightly point out, Macca, I don't think it's retaining players when you actually don't develop them.
Yeah, exactly, and you're quite right. When he started his career, he was an excellent backman, so his one weakness is the fact he lacks polish and skills. But in terms of endeavour and effort, he was holding down centre-half back very well for them. So But as you said, they've murdered him, absolutely murdered him, and to the point where he's become a very, very ordinary player. So I can't see anybody wanting to sign him up.
Well, you could compare how they've developed and used Trangrove to how we've developed and used Daniel Talia. Daniel Talia isn't a terribly, wonderfully skilled player or anything like that, but he's just a hard-nosed defender who will give you an effort every time. Trangrove is very similar. He will give you an effort every time, and he could have been developed into a very good lockdown defender, I believe. But as a result of what they've done with him over the last couple of years, he's devoid of confidence, and as a consequence, you're right, no other club wants him, whereas if he was to be picked up by another club, I could see a club like the Western Bulldogs really benefiting from having a guy like Trangrove at centre-half back just to play that lockdown role.
Yeah, I agree with you. But at the moment, his confidence is obviously fairly low, and to the point where they dropped him. Same with Pittard. I mean, they would say that apparently North Melbourne was supposed to be offering some crazy amount for him, but I find that very hard to believe.
And that's the thing with Trangrove when they've tried to shop him around, but because he was actually still contracted and it was a large salary, no other club was interested.
They also managed to retain the ruckman they've got for another 3 or 4 years that can't get a game.
Well, I think that's the thing. It's a bit of a furphy to say they've got this culture of retaining players when essentially the players they've been trying to offload won't be picked up because the clubs are balking at paying a portion of the salary, which is probably what the deal is. So, retaining your players by default, sorry, Kane Corns, but that's a pretty thin straw to draw, I think, or whatever that saying is.
Sure, I don't know. It's a short boat, or sure, I don't know. Whatever.
Yeah, drawing a long bow, something like that. Anyway, we got to go.
So, who do you guys reckon with the Cockwomble? I still think it's Hayden Kennedy because he's got no idea about how distance works.
Yeah, I think it was absolutely stupid what he said.
Yeah, it hasn't been a big week in Cockwomble land, but no better and more deserving person than Hayden Kennedy. If for nothing else, that he's done a pretty terrible job.
Yes.
There we go.
Anyway, we got no outro music again because I'm still running on a smell of an oily rag. Thanks, IINet and NBN Co, you mob of bastards. So, on that note, don't forget, we will have Scorpus and myself on Thursday night for the preview show, looking at the squads and talking a little bit about the round coming up. We will have... No, we won't have, because I still don't have the right connection, so we won't have a main break show again this week, but we will be back on Sunday night for the wrap, and probably, what time are we playing? It's probably going to be an adjusted time, isn't it, the wrap this week?
Yeah,
well, no, because it should actually, almost as a game finishes, it should be at the... Oh, hang on, is it 3:50? I think it should still finish at the right time with like 10 minutes to go before we're supposed to start.
Yep, so keep an eye on the Big Footy boards or Twitter or Facebook or wherever you usually hook into us just to make sure that you've got the right time. Obviously, all our shows are available on demand from Spreaker.com/users/AFL Crowcast. Good night, Macca. It's been wonderful talking to you. I hope that we didn't interrupt your tea and obvious red wine intake too much.
No, I did hurry home, though.
I was going to say that, yes, there was definitely some partaking of the red wine if Tregenza was involved.
Well, you can't get everything right,
Yeah, that actually should be your tagline, Macca. Hi, I'm Macca. I can't get everything right. And Nikki, thanks again for your contribution. Hopefully you can get back into your study now and smash it out before tomorrow.
Oh, yes. Asian dramatic theories. Awesome.
I don't even know what that is.
I was going to say, I don't know what she's talking about.
Sounds like porn to me.
It is porn.
All right. It's theatre.
Theatre.
Oh, shut up. Right, we got to go. Thanks, guys, on the chat for joining us, and we will see you on Thursday night. Good night, all.
Night, all.
Good night.